Hi, everybody. Alan Adler here on episode 2 of our Sustainable Community Life podcast. I'm excited to come to you today after having recorded our introduction to the podcast, which hopefully will appear below. You can click on that. I hope you listen to that. In the first podcast, we talked a lot about sustainability, community life, why these words were selected for our initiative, and what sustainability and intentionality are about. And really some of the zeitgeist and the context that were essential in the formation of the concept of sustainable community life. And today I'd like to go a little deeper on both of the dimensions that we presented last time. I'm going to do that by presenting a more complete model of sustainability and a way to think about intentionality along the dimensions of sustainability. So let's start with this overarching framework of sustainable community life. And within this framework, you're going to see layers and attributes. So the layers are the circles that sit inside of the star, and the attributes are each of the points on the star. First, we're going to look at the layers. The important thing to mention here is that these are interlocking. So when we look at, for example, the human, which are the two north circles, social and economy, we can see that there's a lot of interplay between how sustainable you are economically and what are the social factors in your community. And similarly, when we look at the intentionality of ecology and sustainable resources, we can see that these are also interlocking as well. And then overall, any pressure point that's placed on one of the layers of sustainability is going to impact the other one. So these are highly dynamic, interconnected 4 layers of sustainability. Now let's turn to the attributes, because we didn't talk about the attributes last time. We can look at them starting at the north with diversity. So diversity really is an important attribute of sustainability because if you look at any natural ecosystem, you see a lot of biodiversity. That means that it's not just a monoculture of one thing, but it's a bunch of different organisms or entities that by virtue of their diversity creates resilience and creates adaptability. Any community that we're looking at that is more diverse will be more sustainable. The second dimension is agility. This is how quickly the community can adapt to change. Agility is super important when threats on the horizon or you see challenges, is the ability to quickly assess what's happening and the ability to quickly respond in such a way as to address whatever's come up. The third element, which is common to the profit model of capitalism, but also, I believe, really important to the creation of sustainability, is a growth mindset. Growth is an important element because when you have growth in an entity, especially if that growth is organic and healthy, we see the formation of greater levels of capacity. Growth typically leads to greater economic opportunity. It leads to more opportunities on the social level. Oftentimes, it introduces new ways to access resources and even creating more innovative and technologically advanced ways to drive ecology. The fourth dimension or attribute of the framework is ecosystematic capacity. Every natural ecosystem that we can identify is nested. And what that means is that each ecosystem is part of another ecosystem. So when we think about sustainability from a community perspective, we need to think about whether or not we are part of another ecosystem. A perfect example of this in the area of ecovillages is that ecovillage is nested within the Global Ecovillage Network, which is a nonprofit that helps ecovillages to thrive. They even have a whole resilience with 20 ecovillages that I'll talk about in another podcast. And then the final element is going to seem a little bit odd, which is redundancy. And the reason the redundancy is so important is because in community, especially in subscale communities where we don't have enough people to fulfill the roles, when we lose one important person, like for example, the farmer leaves the eco-village, you have deep trouble. So having redundancy of people playing multiple roles is really key. So again, here's the whole framework viewed together, and I'm excited to apply some more rigor to determine whether or not I've missed anything, and I'd love to hear any comments from folks who have spent time in the Resiliency Project or who are generally interested in pushing on the envelope of sustainability. The final thing I'd like to talk about today is a deeper dive into intentionality versus conventionality as it relates to the formation or the purpose of being in community. And because today is Models Day in podcast number 2, we have a model for this. So I'm excited to get your resonance on how we're thinking about intentionality as it relates to sustainability in community life. Let's dig in. So in this diagram that you see here, we're making a comparison between community sustainability where we have intentionality and community sustainability when we have conventionality. So you could think of a ecovillage on the left, and you could think of living in the city on the right. And of course, everything is on a continuum. But you'll see the first 4 elements, social, resources, ecology, and economy, are a repeat of the layers that I showed you in the last model. And then we actually added another element on the bottom called zeitgeist. So let's start with the zeitgeist component because I think it provides a context for thinking about intentionality versus conventionality. And again, this is a very simplified model. It's intended to create contrast. There are many versions of living in a city or a village that look more intentional and others that look more conventional. But let's just think of it in terms of continuum. The zeitgeist of an intentional community like co-housing or eco-villages are that the foundations of being in that community are self-determined. That is, we came together and we said, this is what we're doing together. And so we're determining what is the land, what is the building, what is the governance system, what are the different ways that we're going to interact together? How do we address social issues, political issues? Are we going to be spiritual or not? These are all these self-determined aspects. And because the self-determination is such an important part of sustainable community life, we can see that the individual and shared purposes built from that self-determination create meaning. Now, I want to contrast that somewhat starkly with the zeitgeist in conventional life, especially when we're talking about living as a node in a city. And I call the zeitgeist grid dependent because what we're inheriting when we come into that environment is predetermined by the grid that somebody else set up. Where does the energy come from? Where does the food come from? Where does the water come from? The few elements that I talked about before, food, energy, and water. And what ends up happening as a function of the pressure of the grid-dependent system is that it puts an emphasis on comfort and convenience and status above meaning. And this is a central aspect to why conventional life does not provide for social sustainability. Because social sustainability, that is the sense of my aliveness, my meaning, my sense of being, my psychological well-being, etc., cannot be maintained in an environment. Our consciousness cannot increase when the grid is setting the rules and comfort, convenience, and status become the pressure points. We could say that this is a function of the human tendency to follow the herd. If the herd is living in a grid-dependent environment, we simply reinforce and reiterate comfort, convenience, and status above meaning. So that's a big zeitgeist associated with this comparison of intentionality and conventionality. But then let's look at each layer of the sustainable community life framework that we talked about earlier in the podcast in the context of intentionality versus conventionality. So I would argue on the social side that socially intentionality, we're focused more on what is communal and how we act in an interdependent way to support community, as opposed to in conventional where we're all spread out socially and we're more independent, which ultimately leads to a disconnection. Whereas on the social side, the communal and interdependent aspects leads to trust. And now I'm making a connection between the social and economic and the more natural system parts, which are the resource and ecology, just to depict how, in my view, conventionality makes sustainability virtually impossible. I'll move now from the social to the economy to make that connection. So on the intentional side of things, on the economy, we see community and relationship being the most important drivers of economic sustainability. Whereas on the conventional side, it's mostly family and money, which ultimately leads to isolation versus a focus on relationship. So just taking into consideration the social and economic aspects of these comparisons, we're comparing trust-based relationships with disconnection and isolation. But let's move into the middle of the diagram and let's look at what happens when resources in ecology are addressed on an intentional level versus on a conventional level. Resources in an intentional community are very local and regenerative. That is, the orientation around ecological self-sufficiency and ecological health and wellness are based on the idea that we will always be regenerative. We'll always look for ways to improve things and make them better. And almost always that happens when the resources are local versus in a conventional life where they're pretty much coming from the grid and everything is in a silo. It's difficult in a city, for example, to have the different parts of the energy system acting in a regenerative way because they're all coming from some silo. The electrical department's providing this, the water department's providing that. You don't have the ability to actually influence or bring agency to regeneration, which is a critical part of creating resource and ecological sustainability. And similarly, from an ecological perspective, we see that we have much more of a sustainable orientation on ecology versus a convenience orientation on ecology. Like, I'll recycle if it's convenient, I'll compost if it's convenient. Whereas within the context of an intentional community, sustainability is a conscious thing. We're actually being conscious about that sustainability component versus being more or less unconscious unless we're guilted or somehow from the standpoint of status. Now it's considered status oriented to have composting, so you get composting. So you can see that in sum, what ends up happening on that resource and ecological level is that we contrast a collaborative model between us, each other, and nature versus a transacting model where nature's actually not even in the mix by virtue of the fact that all that which we need from a resource perspective is provided from the grid, a big supermarket, a big power plant, a big water system. So there you have it, contrasting intentionality where you see trust, relationships, and collaboration with conventionality where we see disconnections, isolation, and transacting versus engaging in deeper relationships. It was great to be with you today. I hope that this deep dive into models, which we won't do every time, was valuable for you. And I am super excited about hearing your thoughts. Feel free to comment in the show notes, and I look forward to seeing you next time.